Welcome to our first State of Democracy lecture of the year. I'm Grant Reher, director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, and we're delighted that Jean Bethke Elshtain has agreed to reprise an earlier visit to Maxwell in order to have a retrial for democracy. I think democracy needs another hearing, to say the least. But before I say a bit more about her, I want to give some thanks to the Dean's Office for supporting the series, and for technical support, the Information and Computing Technology Group, and in particular, Tom Fazio. I also want to thank my colleague Elizabeth Cohen, who helps organize the series, and Bethany Wallowender and Kelly Coleman, who work in the Institute and help put together this event. In addition, I want to give a very quick preview of the series for this year. After today, in late October, we'll hear from Jonathan Oberlander, an expert on Medicare, and in January, Economics Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom will speak. She'll be followed by the homecoming of our former colleague, Arthur Brooks, now the president of the American Enterprise Institute, who will assess the current state of American conservatism. Now, as we have sometimes done in this series, we're trying something a bit different this afternoon. Professor Elshtain will speak first for about 25 or 30 minutes or so, and then each of our three respondents will pose a question, one, maybe two, to her related to our topic, which they will briefly ground in a context. So in other words, the wind-up to their questions will be their commentary. Then the three of them will briefly talk publicly amongst themselves, and following that, we'll ask you to get involved and pose questions or offer points about what they've said. Then, as is our tradition, we'll continue the conversation out in the foyer over food and drink, and Professor Elshtain will also sign copies of her books, as well as some of the other participants in today's conference, of which this talk is the culminating event. First, very briefly, the three questioners, all of whom deserve a longer introduction, but in the interest of time, I'll just make my apologies to them. Rochelle Gurstein is an independent scholar and writer and the author of, among many works, The Repeal of Reticence. Peter Levine is the director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, better known as CIRCLE, at Tufts University. He's a former Rhodes Scholar and the author of The Future of Democracy. And Wilfred McClay is the SunTrust Bank Chair of Excellence in Humanities at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and also a scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He's the author of The Master Lists. Now to the main speaker. Jean Bethke Elshtain is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Social and Political Ethics at the University of Chicago's Divinity School. She also holds an endowed chair at our former rival, Georgetown University. In a political world of hyper-partisanship, Professor Elshtain is a political thinker who is impossible to pigeonhole. She's an extremely prominent public intellectual. I won't try to list all her books and awards and councils, but I'll note that she has delivered the Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh and has served on the President's Council of Bioethics. Her books include Democracy on Trial and Just War Against Terror, The Burden of American Power in a Violent World. And I imagine she'll get some questions on both of those topics. And finally, I want to note that she may be the hardest working scholar in political theory. Today, she's already been at an all-day conference at which she has given a formal presentation, and she's been interviewed for Campbell's radio program. So, Jean, welcome back to Maxwell.
Well, thank you very much, Grant. It is indeed an honor to return to Syracuse University. My last visit was over a decade ago, hence pre-9/11, just before we decided, and hence a rather different time. I am also indebted to Professor Elizabeth Lash Quinn, who organized the day-long conference on the self and emotions you heard referenced, that some of us have benefited from enormously. And I had the added treat of saying something to you, a few words, about a topic that I have addressed over the years, namely the future and fate of American democracy. A personal note before I begin. It has been 17 years, as hard as that is for those of us who were close to him to believe, since we lost the distinguished American historian and intellectual Christopher Lash, Betsy's father. And I hope Betsy will forgive me for interjecting this personal note. Kit Lash was a citizen who loved his country and a critic who lovingly criticized that country. Over these past 17 years, we have missed his distinctive voice and insights, and it is a gap that none of us can fill. I would like to dedicate my remarks today to his memory. Perhaps you've noticed something if you attend academic conferences from time to time, especially if the participants are practitioners of the human sciences, and that is a concern for the bottom line. What is the takeaway? Just last week, a speaker at a conference I was attending began his presentation by saying, well, these are the takeaways before I begin. Now, the problem here is not that listeners shouldn't take something with them after they've heard a lecture or read a paper, but that we reduce everything we say or read to certain functionalist imperatives. We become impatient with long and complex arguments and accounts. We want to get right to it. Well, that is not my way. Rather, I hope to offer up descriptions of contemporary events that challenge and trouble us and prompt us to think of how we as citizens can respond and how we as sentient human beings can reflect. And the two activities can and must go together. In 1995, as you heard, I published a book called Democracy on Trial. We were at that time embroiled in a debate over the fate and future of American civil society. Social scientists had accumulated mountains of data that demonstrated convincingly the thinning out of America's network of civic associations. Millions of fewer Americans were engaged in civic volunteer work than at a prior time. Civics education had rather mysteriously disappeared from public school curricula. The noble category citizen seemed to mean less and less, to have lost its evocative resonance of the sort displayed in a quiet moment from one of director John Ford's masterpieces, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. To the best of my knowledge, no one has made much of the brief scenes I'm going to recount for you, but they've stuck with me, given their poignance. And this is what I'm referring to: a small immigrant family, husband, wife, and their grown daughter, played by Vera Miles, who is loved by the two male protagonists in the film, played by John Wayne and James Stewart. Nice work if you can get it, I suppose. Runs a restaurant in the town of Shinbone. It's really the only restaurant in town, and they work hard from dawn to dusk. The name of the family is Eriksson. They're Norwegian immigrants. The territory in which Shinbone rests is not yet a state, but the majority of its citizens are aiming for statehood, and a big, raucous assembly will be held to determine who will represent Shinbone in the wider territorial assembly and whether they are pro or anti-statehood. The immigrant father, again of Norwegian background, comes out of his house the day this assembly is being held. His wife and daughter are already standing on the porch, very modest little dwelling. He's dressed in his best Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, and he's clutching some precious papers in his hand, and there's a shy, sly smile on his face. His wife throws her arms around his neck, proclaiming, "Oh, Papa, I am so proud of you." As he enters the hall, he checks in, still clutching those precious papers, with these words: "Peter Eriksson, American citizen." And he is beaming the entire time. Now, perhaps only those beleaguered souls who fled to these shores in order to escape a horrific situation of fear or economic deprivation, and who became naturalized citizens, really connect in a deep sense to the full meaning of citizenship any longer. So much so did this seem to me to be the case that in my capacity as co-chair of a task on civic education for the American Political Science Association in the late 1990s, I proposed, only partly in jest, that native-born Americans should be required to take the test administered to all who chose to become citizens. And the reaction, shall we say, was mixed. I had offered the proposal in order to highlight the civics gap, the fact that Americans seem to know less and less about their country's civic projects, its founding principles, and all the rest. No doubt some of you have had who are parents have had the direct hands-on experience of having to help make up for this civics gap by educating your own children to a great extent about democracy and the long, complex story of the American Republic, its premises, its promises, its failures, and yes, its sins. I know I have. No doubt I had this in mind when I made my proposal, but I was also recalling tutoring my maternal grandmother, a Volga German immigrant to these shores, to prepare her for her naturalization examination. Busy from dawn to dusk and beyond with children and work on the small farm that she and my grandfather had acquired by dint of relentless work and a no-frills way of life, to put it mildly, she had not gone through the routine required for citizenship. Having decided that she wanted to become a citizen before she died, my grandmother, who was never comfortable at the steering wheel, drove herself to the Weld County, Colorado courthouse to acquire a booklet to study to help her to prepare for her naturalization examination. And as I was writing these words, I saw her sitting opposite me at her kitchen table, her busy hands in constant motion, wiping off imaginary crumbs from the table. A crumb never had a chance around my grandmother. And I queried, "Grandma, what is the basic law of the land?" "The Constitution, yeah," she responded in her accented voice. "Yeah, Grandma, the Constitution." And so we continued. Why shouldn't we all go through a similar drill? My proposed test didn't fly, to be sure, but surely the civics gap signified something that needed to be filled or refilled. Shouldn't we start teaching civics again as a routine matter? We know from solid research that those versed in civics issues better understand civic processes, how a bill becomes a law, no matter how boring that was when we studied it, and the like. Such folks who've gone through that possess, as a result, a significantly higher sense of civic efficacy than those who do not have this basic knowledge. Well, the civil society debate lasted a few years. Many voices weighed in, many proposals were entertained, and then it faded away as other matters vied for our time and attention, and new crises took front and center. So my book, Democracy on Trial, had come out, it seems, at just the right moment, and its most exigent concerns, as I had voiced them, receded into the background as the civil society debate overall lost steam, with very little resolved, leaving behind a lingering sense that all was not well with us, despite the economic boom of the Clinton years, the whole dot-com bubble, as we now call it. The largely hollow wealth being generated inspired at the time nigh utopian fantasies about our future, individually and collectively. I well recall a television discussion, it was the Lehrer NewsHour, during which I took exception to, from my perspective, the histrionic babbling of my interlocutor, but he was a dot-com enthusiast who opined that somehow traffic jams in our major cities and cancer would all be cured or fixed through some strange alchemy involving the escalating internet and all the new wealth being generated, on and on in this vein. And as I wrote this, I nearly wrote vain, V-A-I-N, instead of vain, V-E-I-N, which I thought was an instructive near slip, as human vanity was certainly on display in the unreasoning utopianism of my interlocutor. And I recall this so clearly because the odd combination of traffic jams and cancer stuck with me. But somehow every bad thing was going to be fixed. That was his point. And we were on an ever upward trajectory, no end in sight, toward fixing it. Well, those expectations were soon to be crushed. What we now face, of course, economically is extraordinarily troubling. If we were in crisis in 1995, we are ever more so in 2011. Now, much that has happened to us is beyond our control, like the plenary jolt administered to the body politic on 9/11. But much else is the direct result of our own human folly and misjudgment, or perhaps better put, a refusal to make perspicuous judgments. Postponing looming problems does not make them go away, as we've learned. Now is a good moment to ask ourselves, what, if anything, can be redeemed from that earlier debate when civil society was on the tip of everyone's tongue? Was it just one of those flurries that comes and goes, the proverbial 15 minutes of fame, or were some basic insights gleaned that are worth reconsidering? Clearly, there's a certain self-interest involved in my answer. I should hate to think I wrote a book entirely for naught, but I think any responsible and reasonable observer of the current situation would concur that many fundamental issues were raised, controversies were unpacked, and provisional solutions were suggested. On this earth, of course, every solution is provisional and partial, for we are not omniscient, and we always operate in a world of imperfect knowledge. Now, I noted in 1995 that many human ills cannot be cured. All human lives are lived on the edge of quiet desperation from time to time. We must all be rescued from fear and sorrow. But I read the palpable despair and violence as dark signs of the times, as warnings that democracy may not be up to the task of satisfying the yearnings it unleashes for freedom and fairness and equality. Now, unsurprisingly, I was taxed by some critics as being far too mordant in my observations in 1995, and there was a bit of gloom here and there, but it was always tethered to democratic hope, to what I called democracy's enduring promise. When asked by a reporter for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, what does it mean to you to be an American, I had responded, it means that one can share a dream of political possibility, which is to say, a dream of democracy. It means that one can make one's voice heard. It means individual accomplishment as well as a sense of responsibility. It means sharing the possibility of a brotherhood and sisterhood that is perhaps fractious, as are all brotherhoods and sisterhoods, and yet united in a spirit more of good than ill will. It means that one is marked by history, but not totally burdened with it and defined by it. It means one can expect some basic sense of fair play that will be recalled and called upon, and I concluded that was the best that I could do. Now, it still is, but there's considerable fleshing out to do. Of the many issues that beckoned for my attention for this occasion, including the ongoing threat of terrorism, which was scarcely on the radar screen. Seems a long time ago, doesn't it? 1995. I have no doubt that we and the Clinton administration should have been paying more attention, but it just wasn't an issue for the most part. But no issue, it seems to me, more important now, if we sort of bracket that one, than our radically transformed social ecology. So I decided to turn to a cluster of concerns I noted in 1995 that now pertain ever more so. What I addressed specifically and very briefly earlier, that earlier book, were proposals for improving democracy via televoting as a way to conduct democratic affairs. The idea was that we would have democracy by a kind of plebiscite, a teleplebiscite. I observed that plebiscitarianism had historically been a tool deployed by authoritarian and corrupt regimes to shore up their power. It wasn't necessarily a democratic instrument at all. This sort of crude electronic populism, I argued, did not invite the sort of democratic deliberation on which a robust republic relies. Indeed, quite the opposite. It invited rather policy by instant passion. For example, at the time of the hostage taking in Iran during the presidency of Jimmy Carter, the immediate reaction, according to all the polls in the United States, was that we should just go in and take out Tehran. That would mean killing the American hostages seemed to be a secondary consideration. We should just go in and take it out. After a few weeks, cooler heads prevailed. The public had considered the issue. Responses were far more nuanced and complex. Were our policymakers bidden to do instantly what telepolling dictated, the response, I think, would be a catastrophe much of the time. human rights respecting democratic systems have always relied on mediating institutions and ways of modulating the will of the people rather than permitting that will transparent control of public life. So that's what I had to say. I said being asked to give your opinion and being given a chance to register it instantly may at first seem democratic, but the individual in this formation or formulation is the private person enclosed within himself or herself rather than the public citizen. A compilation of opinions does not make a civic culture. Added to this, there is a dynamic I tagged the politics of displacement. When one adds that in, what one finds is a culture that is fixated on publicity or celebrity and that ongoingly displaces private issues onto a public stage. Another side to this coin is, of course, that public issues become over-personalized. Everything is evaluated through the prism of me. The complete collapse of a distinction between public and private has been anathema to constitutional Democrats who hold that the difference, the distinction between public and private identities and commitments, that distinction is of vital importance. Historically, it has been the anti-Democrats who have demanded unified, overweening loyalty to a regime, like the French revolutionaries, for example, unclouded by other commitments and loyalties and values. We cannot permit private values to in any way impede this unified sole sort of focus on support for the architects of the terror in this case. One's loyalty to the revolution must begin with the heart, they argued. So revolutionaries were obliged to track down all those who held any reservations about the revolution in any particular in their hearts and minds, to discern that and to eliminate them. Well, this is an extreme version of the public-private collapse, as is 20th century totalitarianism. But we have our own soft version, and the dismal role it plays has, if anything, been magnified by revolutionary changes in communication over the past 15 years. Let me explain. There are days, as I've already said, when 1995 seems a very, very long time ago indeed. The social network was just a blip on the screen, if you will forgive me. It had yet to explode. Some of us were just beginning to adjust to this thing called email. I recall commenting in print that over the course of my professional life, from 1973 to 1995 to that date, academic life had been one dizzying speed up. One went from what we call now snail mail and carbon copies and mimeographing. Does anyone remember a mimeo machine? Then we went to Xerox copying, then we went to express mail, then we went to faxing, then we went to email. The little social graces that permitted one a bit of a respite, a bit of extra time. Editor calls, yeah, my article's in the mail, when perhaps it was, a day and a half away from being mailed, but given the vagaries of the mail, that was okay. Those little sort of places, that one was not being totally importuned, those have been entirely effaced. People want stuff and they want it now. Messages become more importunate, patience grows thinner. I cannot even begin to estimate the number of people I have vexed and in some cases made irate, given my wayward way with email. Some folks evidently have the email turned on at every moment, day or night. Respondents is the most remarkable thing. Certainly the expectation has grown that one will respond more or less instantly. But that speeding up of our lives, to which one must add the cell phone, of course, is not my primary focus. Rather, I want to talk briefly about the social network, or so-called social network. Is it social, or is it faux social? And at its heart, really a privatizing phenomenon, masquerading as something outgoing, that registers, taps, and extends our sociality. I'm going to opt for the latter, knowing as I do so that I'll be in hot water immediately, given how many millions of people are deeply vested in online pretty much everything. Now, there have been some studies, of course, indicating that the more hours one spends online, the fewer hours one spends interacting with concrete, real-life human beings. This is not surprising, is it? There are a finite number of hours in the day. There have been studies showing the ways in which the new social media are distracting. Two people are at lunch. You've seen this happen. Both are busy staring down at their iPads or their text messages, sitting across from one another but not communicating with one another at all. The social network then can easily be community on the cheap. That is, it taps our desire and our need to be in touch with others, and this way one can be in touch without touching. It registers our need for friends, and one can have many, many friends absent any of the depth and tone and texture and responsibility of real friendship. Now, I know, again, these will be taken as the grumpy rumblings of a Luddite. That's one way we have of avoiding having certain public cultural conversations. We simply accuse someone of nostalgia. I remember having a conversation with Kit Lash about this, about the accusation of nostalgia, how it's a way of trying to push some issues out of our sight. Go away, we don't want to discuss it. So we're just going to locate it as nostalgic. For beleaguered parents who are trying to hold the line at, say, not permitting a child to sit at family dinner and a text message away at the same time, dealing with the new media is often a rearguard action, because it's one they themselves are immersed in much of the time. We like the word community. We like it a lot. So we talk blithely of internet communities or online social communities without any real encounter with what community involves and why plural communities of care and responsibility lie at the heart of a flourishing civil society. Any weakening of this network of institutions perforce weakens democracy. So a concrete project for those I call citizens who live in hope is to name things accurately and appropriately. So let's consider the appropriation of the word community by enthusiasts of cyberspace. Community derives from the Latin, as many of you know, communis, from which communion, communicate, even the reigning image of the person in Christian anthropology as one born in communio, all usher. Community is grounded, tactile, relational, fleshly, or at least it must begin in this concrete way and in principle be open to such instantiation, such realization or embodiment. It implicates us in a world of others who bind us to them, as well as to a time and place. By contrast to the concrete, nitty-gritty nature of real community, think of that reality called virtual. Now, I submit, and some of you will not have studied early Christian history, I know that, so the reference point may seem obscure. I hope not. This is a form of Gnosticism, a kind of disembodied spiritual stuff only, that's parasitic upon the realities, the concrete realities that thoroughgoing cyber rights disdain, with their labeling of people who are not totally caught in the web as people of no account. Rights critic Mark Sluka, already we are told, technological prostheses have begun to liberate us from the limitations of the human body. The possibilities are endless. Within the span of our children's lifetimes, we are assured it will be possible to link the human nervous system into RAM, random access memory, effectively preserving it in some artificial state. Within the foreseeable future, the dividing line, I'm still quoting, between nature and technology, a false dichotomy, we are told, since at least the invention of agriculture, that will be erased. Genetic engineering in general, and the Human Genome Project in particular, have already blurred that line forever. Now, divorced from our bodies, so the scenario runs, all boundaries between self and other, male, female, anything, everything disappears. We can be anyone we want. We can go anywhere we want. We can do anything we want. Reality loses all meaning. And so does community when it takes place in cyberspace and involves no concrete relations of human beings embodied one to the other. Disdain for the limitations of the natural world, including our physicality, that disdain really skyrockets. If we embrace this distinction with its obliteration of any concrete reference points, we have an image of relativistic ephemera. All that is solid melts into air, and we take the air for the thing itself. So this is a form of techno-Gnosticism. All is spirit, all is intellection, bodies matter not, and yet there is a desire to appropriate concrete words as a mimetic imperative. We want the word, and then we radically alter the meaning and lose the meaning accordingly, and yet we want to hold on to the word. Take these words away, redefine them, lose the concrete reference points. Now let me make something very clear. The social network taps into something deeply human and perduring about our natures. But it is a flawed instrument that gives one a simulacrum of the real thing only. So you can never be satisfied. We have 400 friends, but we want more. We know someone who has 622. We check in with 6 chat rooms regularly. Not enough. Let's make it at least a dozen. As we lose the habit of really engaging other people, we become habituated to that abstract form of glancing engagement, because we can turn it off at any moment, through the chat room. Now, I recall very well that one of the last observations Kit Lash proffered to me concerning the fate of America was to worry that we had lost a culture of democratic argument. Now, not every debate can be Lincoln Douglas, of course, but surely it isn't too much to expect or hope that a few debates might rise above the sensationalistic, the humdrum, getting one's message out. When things go awry politically, we don't assess critically the policy or program. We decide the message just hasn't gone out. We've got to do more publicity. So in the current administration, they say we've got to get the president to give more speeches in visually friendly venues and so forth. So you can displace the concern from a policy to we just haven't been good in the publicity. This has become, and this is not a criticism exclusive to the Obama administration, it's just that that's happened so recently that it's on one's mind. This has become yet another way to avoid genuine encounters about important differences, the sort that one has with Democratic opponents, who are not, as Abraham Lincoln told us, on the eve of the horrors of a civil war, who are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Well, enemies we became then, and in many cases, it seems, enemies we are now. On 2 different occasions, for example, and in university settings, I heard people that I thought were responsible proclaim that President George W. Bush should be shot, taken out, because that is what one does to Hitler. We've all witnessed media obsession with the clothing, the hair, the makeup, the shoes, the married lives of female political candidates, as if that's the most burning question about them, or whether Michelle Bachmann's husband is really gay. You know, that's become somehow a big issue. And at times, of course, this can become terribly cruel. I recall some of the online blogs attacking Sarah Palin and her husband for being socially reckless and irresponsible by giving birth to a deformed infant, a Down syndrome child, who would be a burden to American taxpayers because of programs funded under the Americans for Disabilities Act. So a family matter becomes grist for the mill for pseudo-political commentary. And this doesn't happen on the farthest shores of madness in our current political scene exclusively. Many of you may recall an essay in an honored and respected journal on why it was entirely reasonable to hate, not to oppose or disagree with, but to hate President Bush. Now let me note that I have knowingly offered these particular examples in order to bring some balance into what are often unbalanced discussions in the contemporary academy, where we hear a lot about the follies of the right, not very much about the follies of the left. So I propose equal criticism of follies. So that's why I was giving you the examples that I was giving you. It's been a tag team effort on both sides to debase our political discourse. There are nasty and stupid things that substitute for authentic political concerns that come from both sides. My astonishment since the last decade of the 20th century is how often the displacement of politics and media distortion has gone mainstream. It's not just with recognizably goofy outlets, but it's really become mainstreamed in some way. What can be an instrument for good? Human rights networks, increasing transparency so that tyrannical human rights abusing regimes cannot so readily hide their handiwork, can also be a force for desocialization, for isolating us rather than really connecting us, and for displacing private issues into politics, thereby downgrading those concerns that pertain to all of us without distinction, that speak to a good that we can come to know in common, that we cannot know alone. In a way, many of the instrumentalities that now charm and fixate us are seen as promoting and sustaining democracy, on generating friendship, and on creating community. Many of those instrumentalities are reminiscent of a promise in the 19th century among theologians that there were shortcuts to heaven, to the celestial city of Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And I can't resist giving you a peek into Nathaniel Hawthorne's brilliant send-up of the new modern theologizing of the day that held that the old arduous path to the celestial city, with the pilgrim bearing his burden of sins on his back, could be turned into a super hot railway that would get us there quick, without all the messy stuff about sin and remorse and penance, meaningful membership in a church body, and so on. Just as the social media and all that gloms onto it promises a painless way to get to community and to friendship and to human identity and to democracy. Now, in this brilliant send-up, Hawthorne writes, it's an 1843 story, of this gleaming new railroad that will take the faithful to the celestial city without this arduous pilgrimage. You hop aboard, Mr. Smooth It Away will get you to the promised city. You can avoid the Slough of Despond, where Bunyan's protagonist, Christian, was nearly entrapped. You can avoid the battle with the monster named Apollyon and every other obstacle. One great convenience of the new rapid transit way to get to the celestial city is that, as I've indicated, you don't have to make your way with your burdens on your back. You can check your baggage and be done with it. As for the monster Apollyon, well, he is now tamed as the chief engineer on the train. All of this shows, according to Hawthorne, the liberality of the age. This proves, if anything, that all musty prejudices are in a fair way to be obliterated. And as they streak through the countryside, the modern pilgrims notice some old-fashioned pilgrims making their labored way, and they call them preposterous and obstinate, ridiculous. Mr. Smooth It Away, Mr. Live for the World, Mr. Hide Sin in the Heart, Mr. Scaly Conscience, and some gentlemen from the town of Shun Repentance are all reassuring on this score. So they race through a tunnel quickly, you don't have to go up the hill of difficulty. There are no arduous ascents or descents. Go through this tunnel, no terrible giants any longer that threaten to seize the travelers. There is one new giant called Giant Transcendentalist. He's German by birth, and his world is a heap of fog and duskiness. So it's very difficult to know exactly what he's talking about, and you can easily get around him. More characters pop up, all designed by Hawthorne to spoof the theology of his day for believing there were shortcuts. Alas, it turns out that the Lord of the celestial city will not take in the passengers from the train, for indeed there really are no shortcuts. Even worse, some of those assisting on the voyage turn out to be cohorts of Satan himself, including Mr. Smooth It Away, for the train leads straight to hell. Now, and then Hawthorne says, oh, I woke up and it was just a dream, thank goodness. We may not believe in hell any longer, but we live in a time of shortcuts. We want to obviate arduous processes. We want to pave the way as easily as we can. And somehow, in this yearning, the tone and texture of much of contemporary life has coarsened. The tone and texture of contemporary criticism has become more vulgar, more nasty, and this over the past few decades. Criticism partakes now of some of the worst features of the culture rather than tapping into the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln put it. So one must walk a line, as I move to conclude here, between calling attention to dire problems, some of which cut to the very heart of who we are as a people, between that and cynicism. We must walk a line between proposing problem-solving solutions that only generate more problems and solve nothing at all, between sort of facile optimism, in other words, we'll fix it, facile optimism, and a more sober hope. I know that American politics has always been a blood sport on some level, but it is getting awfully ugly out there. In part, I think, because we scrutinize every candidate's life and history in every aspect, respecting no boundaries of decency or privacy in the process. We drive many good people away from public life and service because they want to put neither their families nor themselves through the ugly and demeaning hazing now required. And in this process, we depoliticize politics and we over-politicize intimate life. There is, of course, others have told us, no haven in a heartless world for us. Every haven has been invaded and pervaded by the logics of our techno, cyber, consumerist culture. And at times it seems you have to be a hero of sorts to stand against it. And God did not make us to be heroes. God knows. It is triumph enough some days just to get up and go to work. That God does raise up heroes among us from time to time reminds us that things could be different, that we don't have to go down this path, that we can stand apart, or we can stand in front and push back, at least a little bit. We are not flotsam and jetsam, tossed wildly about in the storm. But we don't have to be heroes to be a bit kinder, a bit more forgiving of one another, and at the same time, more demanding and what we expect from those in authority and from ourselves. For as the cartoon character Pogo said so many years ago, during a different time of democratic crisis, we have met the enemy, and he is us. Thank you very much.
Rochelle, do you want to start? No, you don't want to start. Okay. Wilfred?
Oh, yeah, okay. Now I'm to propound two questions for Jean.
I'm not sure what your mark.
I think that's what.
Is your mic turned on?
Yes, I think so. First of all, thank you. This is characteristically wonderful, and I have a couple of points or things I'd like to ask you to maybe go into a little further, or maybe confirm my own suspicions. You know, it's one of those kinds of questions. But on the social media question, one of the things that strikes me that's especially, and it goes to this issue of the decline of democratic argument, which I think is such a powerful point, that it does seem to me that social media, and I imagine every one of us feels the pull of this in some way, that you can immerse yourself in a world of blogs and publications and various things that that merely reflect back your prejudices, your your prearranged disposition about all kinds of things, and never have the experience of encountering something genuinely different that comes from a position of integrity but is entirely different. And that seems to me an extension of something that's been going on for a while, which is captured. I forget who said this, but someone said the only common experience since the end of the draft, the only common experience that Americans have is going to the Department of Motor Vehicles. And of course, we don't even have that now, at least where I live, we can do it in the mail. But this notion that we no longer have the kinds of common experiences and common frames of reference that make for lives together as citizens, and citizens being people who are very different. There's no great trick to being an enthusiastic member of a social group which consists of people who agree with you. Right. The trick is to take part and have a faithful engagement with something where the opinions and perspectives are very different. So I wonder if that's if that's a perspective that can be drawn out of your remarks about social media, and if this is true, what can we do about this? I mean, I'm all with you about each one of us in small ways, and I tend to the sort of William Blake perspective that the greatest good is done in minute particulars, and the suspicion of revolutionary projects. But what can we do about that? Should I let her answer that one, and then?
Shall I respond to each one in turn?
Well,
okay.
Yeah, I'd like to let her do that, and then and then I have a second question.
Okay. Well, I will confirm your search for confirmation about these issues, but I want to add a little bit more. That is, there's been a kind of marketization, sorry for the ugly word, of the internet, if you will, or of the places that we can go to. So we can easily, as you say, avoid anyone who disagrees with us. One of the things that this has done, to add another moment of gloom here, is that conspiracy theory advocates are on the rise. Used to be that you would have a conspiracy theory person here or there. They're sort of separated. They can't so easily make common cause. And now it's much easier for conspiracy theorists to contact one another, to network with one another. So it's unsurprising that the number of Americans who adhere to some conspiracy theory, those numbers seem to be on the rise. And the number of sites you can go to that are absolutely astonishing in their hatefulness is quite shocking. I was at a conference not long ago where there was a presentation on the anti-Semitic sites that are so readily available. And the researcher had gone to only 32 of them, and there are many more. So you can easily have your hatefulness confirmed rather than challenged. Now, what can we do about it? Let me just, before I say what we can do, let me just add again that there are many, many wonderful things that have happened because we've got stuff available to us online. For example, I'm a member of the Scholars Council at the Library of Congress. People can enjoy many of the documents now, the riches of the library, who never had the opportunity to do that before. You know, they can go to their little local library, if it's still open, and go online and do research and see things that are quite extraordinary, never before available. So I want to add that, just so you know. I'm not saying, you know, we should somehow miraculously make this disappear. We can't. So what can we do about it? It's very difficult to know what to do about it, save to say that the more that, this is going to maybe get a little recondite, but the more disappearances that we see of spaces where people might come together to discuss issues, the more those are effaced, the more they disappear, the more likely people are, in fact, to turn to the computer, to this essentially privatizing activity. because they don't know where to go to talk about these things. Far better for the raging anti-Semite to go to a public meeting and voice some hateful views and have those challenged than for him to be able to sit there and have them confirmed ongoingly. But where does one go? Where does one take these grievances? And I think that's been a real issue. It taps into the civil society debate we were having earlier. It's also a reason why I think that many of us should not, at every moment when the topic comes up, should not just despair of or attack something like the Tea Party. That's a grassroots effort. We disagree with, I'm sure most people in this room disagree with the basic sort of libertarian, well, I shouldn't make that assumption. I assume a number of you, many of you, disagree with some of the basic assumptions of the Tea Party movement. But, you know, why should we simply approach that negatively? Here are people who had concerns, who were angry in many cases, who voiced those concerns, who went public in a way that I think is salutary, in that their ideas now have to be challenged. Their ideas have to meet the test of being engaged by others. Far better that should happen than that people should simply retreat into themselves and nurture this sense of grievance and of rage and of helplessness. And when you go out and you test these ideas in the public square and you have to meet certain standards, you field people for public office, you find them in some cases winning, but in many cases losing because they can't appeal outside the group. I think that's the way democracy works and works well. Well, let me just stop with that.
Let me, if I can, move on to Rochelle because I'm mindful of giving
Yeah, okay, right.
Yeah.
Yes. I wanted to, it occurred to me when Professor Elshtain said, you were commenting about the .com enthusiast who said the cancer and traffic jams would be cured. This is just a sideline. It made me think of Ortega y Gasset in the 1920s talking about the characteristic signs of modernity, which for him were aspirin and the speeding car. And it's not exactly the same. I mean, it's a very, it's
strange juxtapositions.
Right, but it was the same kind of thing of a kind of, the aspirin would cure all that ails you with cancer, being the one that they're talking about now, and the speeding car, as opposed to the traffic jam, but the speeding car being the speed of modern life. He kept referring to that. And I think this was in the Dehumanization of Art book or The Revolt of the Masses. I don't remember which one, or maybe in both, but they were in the 1920s. And this, I mean, you had many interesting things to say, and I found myself agreeing with almost all of them. And that made me think. One of the reasons I agree so much with Professor Elshtain was that I was a student of Christopher Lasch's, and the two of them were friends and had much in common, so I think that's probably why. But it made me think, made me think actually of many of the things you were saying about our cyberspace world. It made me think about earlier debates about mass culture in the 1940s and 50s. I guess I'm struck by there's certain things that Professor Elshtain said that just, for me, are truths, and I endorse them. And I don't know how to convince someone who doesn't believe them that they're not true. I mean, this thing about the speeding car and aspirin, when I read that, something in the 20s, I said, yes, I can see what he meant. I don't know how, I guess what I'm wondering is, how do you convince someone of ideas that we've heard many times over? I mean, I think the debate about the internet world is a latter-day debate about the mass culture and that the mass culture debate is a latter-day debate about the speeding car. I mean, we've been seeing this, I guess, since the 19th century with industrialization, a fear about the sped-up quality of the world, superficiality versus depth. I think of Kundera. I was speaking to someone earlier about Kundera's ideas about weight and lightness, the unbearable lightness of being, these kinds of questions. And they almost feel to me to be a temper or an aesthetic moral kind of judgment that's very hard to give reasoned debates for, that an idea appeals to us because it's reasonable and just, but also for other reasons. You spoke, when you're speaking, I was thinking of ideas about tragedy, paradox, irony, which is your sensibility, versus progress, what was it, Mr. Smooth It Away, versus striving, difficulty. These are themes that keep reoccurring in different contexts. And I don't know how to, I'm getting at, I guess, is it a matter in the end of sensibility? This goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier today in the earlier panels. How do you persuade someone of something that might be as much sensibility as idea?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and let me approach it in this way. It may be that, we are talking about two basic kinds of sensibilities here. Those who believe the universe is, so to speak, curable. We can fix everything. We've got solutions. We can make it all work. We can smooth it away. And those who believe no such thing, who are not necessarily cynical and despairing, but who believe that, as you said, and I've emphasized, there's tragedy, there's paradox, there's irony. We can never be perfect. We can never know everything. There's a politics suggested by these two sensibilities. The latter, I think, is a politics of greater modesty. We don't know everything, so we should not base our policies on the presumption that we do. We know enough to know that many proposed grand changes in our political life have had unintended consequences that were quite horrific. And many of those possible unintended consequences were actually raised at the time, the policies as possibilities. At the time the policies are being contemplated, but they were ignored completely. You're just against progress. So it suggests that for some, it's full steam ahead at every moment, ignore the irritants in the image, and others, it's hold on, let's be more modest. Let's try an experiment on a small scale, let's say, if there's some big looming problem. Now, where the problem comes, I think, is if these two sensibilities get hardened into immovable political ideologies and simply start to run on automatically. Don't really encounter one another, which is the problem that you raised. When we don't have these genuine encounters, there's clearly there's some truths in each of these sensibilities, some virtues, and no doubt some vices. But we don't even get to find out what those are because we don't have the kind of engagement we should have. And there's a certain extent to which that's always been true, I suspect. But I think it's more true for us as the points of commonality that we once shared with one another as citizens, as those fade away. Now, Lincoln could assume that everyone listening to him knew the Bible, for example. He could speak in that language. People might not even be able to read, but they'd heard it. So he could use that biblical language so powerfully in his speeches. We can't assume that frame of reference anymore at all. I encounter students at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. I have a joint appointment there in Divinity and political science, who have no knowledge of the Bible at all. Now, you would think that Divinity students might have some references, but not necessarily. I mean, they perhaps were brought up on the Mr. Smooth It Away, theology, where the Bible is a kind of artifact, but it's not something that you take to heart and make your own, in some sense, so that you can speak from it, and the references are there. Our civic references have faded a bit, our shared rituals. I was thinking of the shared ritual of voting, and how wonderful it was on that autumn day to go out there and join the line with your fellow citizens and chat with one another, and people would bring their kids, and they'd have their dogs, and every now and then someone would come with coffee and donuts, and you'd really engage. And now it's like, this is ridiculous. Why do we have to put people through that? Let's just televote. Let's do it some other simple way. So we lose those points of commonality. And I think that means that the one reason that so many are so concerned is that we know that the possibility of really engaging these sensibilities that possibility gets ever more remote in light of this fact. So I don't know. I can simply elaborate on the problem, I think, and help us understand it. I know no easy way to deal with it.
Great. Well, thank you for that talk, and also the conversation's been good, but very good, but I'm going to take it in a totally different direction.
Okay.
And let me say thank you for the talk, but also thank you and other distinguished colleagues in the 1990s for basically making my livelihood. I mean, I'm literally, the center that I direct was founded out of the recommendations of two different commissions that you served on, the APSA one and the National Commission on Civic Renewal, so that pays my salary. And then a lot of other things were founded then that are residues, I think, of that discussion.
Some good things came of it.
Yeah, well, for example, just as one example, and there are quite a few others, whether they're good is up to the audience to decide, but is that I sit in a college of citizenship and public service, which was founded in 2000 and which has got a $40 million endowment and is its founding sort of answering the kind of claims that you and others were making. So I thought I would say something quickly about how the trends look to me now, and then you could bounce back on it.
Sure.
Because I think we use trends in part. I mean, why do we care about the trends? Something could be bad even if it's not going down, but it's partly because if something's going down, we feel that it should be higher because it used to be higher. So declines are troubling, and I feel that the world looks quite different now. I'll give you one example and then launch into a couple of others. But one of the reasons that people got excited, and I'm not sure it was as much you, but some of your distinguished colleagues, was because of a decline in political participation, particularly voting and particularly among young people. And it was true. There was a decline of about a third in the voting rate among young people. That's between 1972, which was the first year they could vote, and 2000. But 2004 and 2008 were very strong years. And 1972 looks like a bit of a funny year anyway, because it was the year that they got the right to vote in a huge hoopla and so on. If you take 1972 off the graph and you add 2004 and 2008 to the graph, there's no trend at all. Yeah. It's completely flat. So that's an example of how one's perspective is changed by where one sits. Right. So here's just a few thoughts about how things look to me at 2011. Okay. So one, civic knowledge. Political participation, I already mentioned. The last two cycles were extremely high participation cycles. Civic knowledge, completely flat. The best test, the National Assessment of Education Progress in Civics, no change at all since 1970-something. And according to Michael Della Carpini and Scott Keeter, no change in adult civic knowledge over 100 years. Civic education, the input, so civic knowledge is the output, civic education. Changing in complicated ways. 97% of kids in 2010, high school seniors, said that they had studied the American Constitution and government, and that's partly because in 49 out of 50 states there's a state standard that requires that. On the other hand, we've lost the Problems of Democracy course. We lost it a long time ago, before 1995, which was a course that was traditionally about discussing public issues. And on the other hand, the AP government course is the fastest growing course. So we see a changing in the curriculum, but not clearly to me a decline. What I do think is clearly declining is various forms of collective problem solving. So if you simply ask people the question, do you work with others to address community problems, that goes down. And that's partly because, it might be because of motivations and what people want to do. It's partly because of economic and political context, the places where you can engage degenerating. So a lot of locally rooted institutions in decline, the political party as an actual institution, PTAs, non-governmental institutions. I'll mention the newspaper. 1/3 of journalists have been laid off in the 1990s. We don't really have local newspapers anymore. The Boston Globe isn't really a local newspaper anymore. It doesn't do much reporting. That's a huge change. Policy changes, mostly probably for the bad, but one thing that came out of the discussions of the 1990s was the creation, the Corporation for National Community Service already existed as of, 1993 or 4, but it really wasn't very big. Now it's a $1 billion federal agency with quite a broad set of tasks around civic engagement and civic renewal and social entrepreneurship and other things that have been developed since then. Your great book, Democracy on Trial. I own a copy, but this is a library copy because I couldn't find it, so doesn't mean I didn't buy it. But
glad to hear that.
Is mainly about how we talk. It's mainly about discourse and civility and incivility, and also identity politics as a problematic form. I don't know how to assess trends in that. I have a hard, maybe you do. I have a hard time doing it. Obviously, it's harder to measure than voting. but
Sure.
for a particular reason, which I think is worth saying, which is that every utterance is different from all the other utterances. So I don't know what to classify as invidiously uncivil. So when you said, people said George W. Bush deserves to be shot, I agree, absolutely out of place. But people said a lot of bad things about George W. Bush, some of which I think we both would agree, regardless of politics, were acceptable, part of the discourse.
Sure.
So how do you classify? So I don't know what to make of that one, the incivility-civility question. The internet you mentioned as a gigantic trend. My thought about that is, if it's too early to tell whether the French Revolution is a good thing, it's way too early to tell whether the Facebook is a good thing. Partly for a specific reason, which is it keeps changing. It's very protean. It keeps changing its form in unpredictable ways. So a lot of the discussion around 2000, give or take 5 years, was about anonymity. We were going to lose our names. Yeah. But then the most popular application became Facebook, where you have to use your name. Yeah. And Sean Parker, who was one of the founders of it, says the most common thing people do with Facebook is they show pictures of places where they had gathered. They show their friends pictures of their having gathered together. So so if you were worried that in 2000 the internet was going to wipe people's anonymity, make people anonymous. Now what they're doing is actually saying, remember last night when we were all together in this group and showing each other a picture. So I just don't know what to make of the future of that. So I should really stop. But the one more thing is, it seems to me that in 1995, it looked to all of us as if the basic performance of the polity, in terms not of the discourse and discussion, but in terms of its basic sort of agreed upon mission that are in the preamble of the Constitution, was doing quite well. The economy was growing, we were at peace, Soviet Union had collapsed. So other things came into focus. But when you look from 2011 back to, say, 1972, I think most people, regardless of whether they're on the right or the left, think the polity is doing quite badly. Mm-hmm. And we would maybe give different diagnoses, but just for one example, up until 1972, I believe it's true in the entire United States history, there was a very close correlation between the median family income and GDP growth, so that when we grew, everybody grew. And that stopped in 1972. So I think there's sort of basic discontents about the performance of the democracy, which have perhaps eclipsed some of the themes in your book, but maybe they haven't. So I'm sorry. So that was not a question, but you gave me some encouragement before to say something about how things look now. So,
well, again, thank you for those really observations and emendations. I mean, again, very helpful information for sure. And of your long list, I would say that, I didn't spend a lot of time on the vote, as you know, and worrying about young people not voting. I figured that, they'll vote soon enough. I mean, that will happen. But I was concerned very much, I still am, about the whole question of civic knowledge and knowledge of political history. I mean, it's not just a matter, and I'm sorry if I made it sound that way, of knowing the processes, the procedures of democracy, but having some richer, fuller understanding of democratic culture, of what it means to be a citizen, in a fuller, richer sense. And I think that's where the real gravamen of the issue lies, as far as I'm concerned. Not so much in proceduralism exclusively, but a more substantive and richer notion of democratic culture. The indices or the trends that you noted that comport with the worries that I articulated include the working with others, business on the decline. We've talked about that. People don't know where to go with their concerns and how to get together with others to discuss them. I'm glad you mentioned the loss of local newspapers. That is a huge issue. Let me take us back, and maybe this will be a good way for me to stop and open it up to all of you. Back to the man who shot Liberty Valance, if you will, because one of the great characters in that film is the editor of the Shinbone Star, the local paper. And he's the one who's brave enough to stand up to the cattlemen and defend the rights of the small farmers and so forth. He gets beaten nearly to death by Liberty Valance, who takes liberties with other people and does not represent authentic freedom. I think that's one of the things that John Ford tries to show. So that characteristic of the crusty, drinks too much, cigar smoking editor, small town journalist, that's a great storied character in American history, American life. And and the image of the newsroom and so on, that's gone. That's gone. And that's a loss I think we'll be registering for some time to come. Yes, I'll just stop there. Let me just stop there and open it up to you.
So for those who have questions, please wait. There's 2 students with microphones. We need to get you to talk into the microphone so that you'll be part of our archive of the event. So
Whether you want to be or not, yeah.
who would like to, one down here? Where's the microphone?
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the lecture and for your responses to it, and actually
Sure.
for all the time you've put in over the course of the day. I
bet.
appreciate that a lot.
Thanks.
I have a question about social media, Facebook,
Sure.
and so on. Someone I've read, and I want to say it was Zadie Smith in the New York Review, writing a review of the movie The Social Network, actually. And if she didn't write this, someone else did. She said that for her, the scary thing about Facebook, and she's not that old herself, I think, but looking around at Harvard undergraduates, the scary thing was not that it seemed to be putting up boundaries between its users so that they weren't actually physically interacting with each other, but that it was actually part of how they socialized with each other, that this was an essential part of how they experienced the world now, including each other's company. And I'm wondering, what if, from a democratic perspective, what if the developing problem is not the erection of barriers between people and the sort of a loss of intimacy and immediacy and community? What if the problem is actually an expectation of universal access, immediacy, and community, and thus the loss of a sense of the public as something separate from individuals, some common ground that everyone has to go out of themselves to enter?
Well, I actually thought that that's what I was saying, or trying to say, that those kinds of interactions become a substitute for what we once called the public or political life, ways of people coming together, not under the assumption that they're there simply to reinforce one another, but to truly engage and find out about one another. It's very easy through Facebook or these other media to find like-minded folks, and to perhaps make these forms of social communication more, not so much to build up barriers, but to knock them down. I was talking about effacing distinctions so that we don't really come to know other people in some richer, more particular sense. Encounters become rather more generic, perhaps, or there's some assumptions that we can simply break down barriers of any kind. Or let me not say barriers. Let's say we can erode certain constraints and limits on human social relationships. Where we go through a phase, we become friends, before we move to stages of intimacy and so on. And now it's sort of, you can connect online really quick, and do you want to get together and hook up, and, so forth. It makes it facile, it makes it easy, it makes it something that lacks, again, sort of depth and texture and meaning and purpose of some kind. So if that's the kind of worry that you're expressing via that review, then it's certainly one that I would share. I think that analyses of our contemporary campus cultures is a very interesting thing indeed, and there is some sober. You students know this better than I do. There are some sober facts that start to emerge about the quality of social engagement that are quite troubling.
Hello.
Hi.
Am I on? Not too long ago, there was a rock and roll gentleman that said he was abhorred by what he saw as rock stars being created on game shows on TV.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if anyone on the panel could kind of talk about the status of the arts. And,
Yes.
and that's a topic worthy of a lot of
Yeah.
time, but just briefly, and kind of this elevation of kind of kitsch and the effect, where you see that now.
Well, Rochelle is really the person who should who should speak to this, I think, because she's written about kitsch. So I'm going to turn it over to her more or less instantly. But I share the rock star's concerns. I think that that many of these popular music figures are, they're extraordinarily talented, hardworking people. And to see this kitschy stuff, sort of becoming instantly popular, it's got to be difficult. Just like a really superb writer, to see some sort of crummy writer, again, having a best-selling novel, it's got to rankle somehow. But let me turn this over to Rochelle.
There's, of course, a famous essay by Clement Greenberg in 1939 called Avant-Garde and Kitsch that appeared in the Partisan Review, where he was making the point that the two are very much linked, that they came into being around the same time. Again, a version of the mass culture debate. Yeah. I did write a piece about rethinking that piece maybe about 15 years ago. What struck me, and I've thought about this many times, when I was writing that piece, was at least in the art world, when pop art became a thing in the 1960s, people like Andy Warhol, of course, were taking kitsch as their subject matter. So it didn't, at least in the art world, the kitchification of sensibility it was from within. It's not that it was commercialization that did it. It's helped to make it go much further now. There's all those shows on TV about what are they? The latest, the best fashion model, or the whatever they are. There's one now, as I'm sure some of you are aware, about the next great artist. It began last year, where they have projects just like the fashion people or the cooking stars, and they're judged, and they get a show at the Brooklyn Museum, the person who wins. This, from what I know within the art world, is of course thought of as a joke. This is what happens with the commercialization of art as any other commodity, any other celebrity, all the kinds of things we've been talking about. But I think intellectually, there's more, and it's really a long story, which I really can't go into here. But what strikes me is that it was the artists themselves. It wasn't from outside. It was a revolt against abstract art, difficulty, in the name of fun, the new sensibility, pleasure, that came from within the art world and the history of art. It's not the only thing that's going on in the art world today, though Warhol's influence is huge. There's still also serious things that are against that. Serious artists still make art. But I think it's interesting when you look at the intellectual history. It's from within. It's not external to it.
Although there are, may I just very quickly, there are, and I'm not disagreeing with Rochelle, but phenomena now of executives saying, let's think of the next big sort of star we want to create. It's like building the bionic man or woman or something. We want a little bit of Bieber, and we want a little bit of Hannah Montana, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And then they go out and sort of search for this person, find someone who looks the part, plays to the right demographic, and then through all the voice enhancement stuff that's possible now, you can be a singer without really singing, or singing well. And then they create this character, and suddenly it's the next best thing. So I have a hunch that the rock star is referring to phenomena like that, which does come from without, in a sense. It doesn't emerge from within popular music, but it's imposed through commercial ideas.
My question was, do you think that voting is a more important part of civil participation than lobbying and petitioning?
I didn't tell me voting is as important as.
Is voting more important than petitioning and lobbying? As a type of civic participation.
I certainly wouldn't even know how to rank them in importance. I think that voting is the more universal phenomenon, obviously, because the number of people who engage in lobbying and in petitioning is smaller by comparison to the number who vote. And minimally, we certainly expect of citizens that they will vote. We don't necessarily expect that they're going to engage in the other two activities, but if we had a more robust understanding of citizenship, we would expect to see more people engaged in those activities than we now do, the petitioning and lobbying, sort of organizing in behalf of a cause.
I just wanted to go back to this issue, a number you touched on regarding irony and paradox.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the period you're referencing where we see this tremendous decline in civic association, civic engagement, is also this period where we see this tremendous increase in tolerance, inclusion, this kind of broadening of recognition of others in a certain way. And it seems like this is a key paradox to make sense of at the end of the 20th century and certainly the beginning of the 21st. And one could even read Facebook, sort of as Professor Levine was saying, as a possible broadening of democracy, and something that, while it appears as though it's taking us away from each other, also seems to have these qualities of making us more aware and tied together or caring in a way. I'm wondering if there's any way to sort of make sense or to square those costs and benefits.
Yeah. My immediate thought on listening to your very interesting question is that we would probably have to discuss further what all you mean by growing tolerance. But let's just take the issue of race. Certainly there's been an enormous growth in tolerance on the question of race. I mean, it's just that the data is quite extraordinary on that. But as we see the growth in tolerance and acceptance and all sorts of social interaction between whites and African Americans and other groups, let's bear in mind that much of the current tolerance rises on the basis of politics and the tremendous civic organization of people like, the Southern Black Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King, and so on, and their efforts and their sacrifices and their courage and their bravery, that without that civil society, without those efforts in an earlier era, I don't think we'd see, that exponential leap in tolerance that we've seen in later decades. In a way, that growth of tolerance is the fruit of the earlier civil society activity. So I don't think there's really a paradox there so much as a sort of cause-effect in many ways that one could explore at greater depth. On your question of Facebook and so on, I'll simply demur on that and see if Bill wants to say something about that.
Oh, I don't have anything to say about Facebook.
All right.
I would, though, like
Yeah.
to say one thing. So I think there's a tendency that maybe is buried in the question to confuse or conflate the categories of community and the things that pertain to citizenship. And I think it's important to keep them distinct. That, and this sort of goes back to my own remarks and the question to you, that you can have a thriving, vibrant, genuine community that's not yet prepared to act as a polity.
Correct. Right.
To act as a polity, to engage in deliberation, which again involves bringing in all kinds of people with all sorts of perspectives that might not want to be friending one another in other ways. That's a different kind of relatedness, and we tend to confuse them. I think it's good to think of them as being.
That's a good point.
There's all this discourse about civility. It seems to me people think that civility is the same thing, or even tolerance is the same thing as complete and total embrace and acceptance. And these are flinty virtues.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that that we often hear nowadays some scorn heaped on the old-fashioned notion of tolerance. It should be total acceptance. People forget what a hard-won achievement tolerance is, and total acceptance is more than you can expect in a society. People, may embrace tolerance. It doesn't mean they have to love you. It doesn't mean they have to accept everything you do or accept, indeed, in some ways, who you are. I mean, Martin Luther King himself at one point said, "Look, we're not asking you to love us. Just get off our backs." He knew better than to assume that there was going to be some universal love that would come out of a civil rights movement. That sets the bar way too high. So I think that I'm enough of a plain old-fashioned liberal to say that, in the old-fashioned sense, hardly recognizable anymore sometimes, but to say that tolerance is a good thing, you know, and the more of it, the better. But that doesn't mean complete acceptance of anything that comes down the pike.
We have time for one more super quick question and super quick answer, because one of the panelists has a plane waiting for him. So.
My private plane.
A whole plane's waiting for you? Yeah.
I don't think they're going to wait too long for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not one of those private jet owners.
You're not a private jet person? Yeah.
Hi. So,
Hi.
as a product of the social media age, I want to thank you for keeping my attention the whole time because, like you said, we have thin patience, but you were very engaging.
Thank you.
So you got me thinking about going online and chat forums and whatnot, and how you said that a certain attitude can be confirmed rather
Yeah.
than challenged, like in real life or real life.
Yeah,
I thought that
yeah.
was pretty interesting. But then I reflected on experiences that I had where I post in, for example, Yahoo Answers that goes to a very broad range of perspectives, and I'm actually challenged in a variety of ways
Good.
by examples like that. And I think that that's
Yeah.
one aspect that's
Yeah.
kind of greased over a lot because that combined with the rate that information is flying at us, because there's so much, we have to
Yeah.
kind of sort through
Yeah.
it and figure out how to process. And sure, you can shut off, or like you can just kind of turn the computer screen off and live in your own world, or I think that you can consider things in the grand scheme of the information. And I think that rather than taking a political perspective, which is actually in one of my class readings, someone said that we're more about the individual now than about political parties. I guess I'm seeking confirmation in thinking that that's true, because I think people, when sorting through this information, rely more on a sense of ethics rather than
Yeah.
political confirmation. And you also see that when people cherry pick from politicians too,
Yeah.
and their points
Yeah.
of view.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. It made complete sense. Thank you. No.
And you kept her attention the whole
Yeah,
time.
you kept, I was rapt. I was engaged. No, you kept my attention. That's very interesting. Thank you very much. I'm not going to worry about you. I think you're doing just fine. And I think that I think that kind of engagement you talk about, posting something, getting some disagreement, that's a terrific thing. The thing that I was more concerned with was when people go only to go to those sites where their views or prejudices are going to be reinforced and confirmed, and that it's very easy to do that now, much easier than at any previous point, because you can find so many places that say, yeah, you're right, the wicked Jews are behind this, or the other evil group is behind that. So it's those sorts of things that are particularly worrying. And then the aspect of a certain kind of desocialization of people in a way. That is, your remarks that I thought were quite excellent about individual more important than political parties and so forth. I can very well understand that given the current status of our political parties in the United States. But I think that we shouldn't set up a dichotomy between a certain concern for and respect for the individual, between that and our engagement as citizens in our civic capacities with something that attaches our concerns to the concerns of others and to the kind of place that we live in, the kind of community that we want to cherish and sustain. So you might think about that connection, not so much to political parties as to efforts that connect you to others that are not just your individual concerns or theirs. Okay.
We have taken away the iPhones of the four panelists so that when we go out to the reception now, I encourage all of you to seek them out, continue the conversation, and you will have their attention the whole time. So thank you very much.
No.